Sauerkraut is important. First of all, it's great for you. All of these fermented foods help your gut, and they're tasty. It's also got some interesting history. Here in Appalachia, if it hadn't been for fermented foods like sauerkraut, our ancestors might not have made it through those long, cold winters. It's a way of preserving food that doesn't require any kind of refrigeration or even cooking. The good thing about it is that it's really easy to do, and I'm going to teach you how to do that today. I'm Katie Hoffman. I'm the Executive Director of Create Appalachia, and we are an arts-based business incubator, and we serve creatives and creative entrepreneurs in the region. Today's presentation is coming to you as part of our Create a Stir series, which is a food-centered series that's made for culinary creatives and creative people who like to cook. Today, I'm going to show you how to have a little taste of Appalachia in your kitchen. So easy. First thing I did was go out and get a beautiful organic cabbage. I like to use organic produce because it's usually pretty fresh, and it is always kind of crunchy, and it's full of liquid. Now, one of the things that sauerkraut does is it makes its own brine. There's a lot of water in sauerkraut. You want to pick it up and feel how heavy it is. That tells you a lot about how much moisture there is in it. And I don't know if you can see this, but right here, there's some moisture here along the stem. So this is a good sign that you're going to get a lot of brine that'll come out of that cabbage. Some people will save these big outer leaves and they'll use them to set down to hold the sauerkraut under the brine. We're not necessarily going to need that because I've got these beautiful crocks made by our local potter, Carrie Porcher. And he made weights to go inside them. That's another thing we need. We've got this beautiful cabbage, and people get really precious about how to cut up their cabbage. I am not precious about how to cut up my cabbage. I just take my knife. I've already washed this one, by the way. I take my knife and I just... You can kind of hear how juicy that one is. You can kind of tell it's going to be a good cabbage by the crunch of it. If you go to the store and you find a cabbage that is kind of dry and shrivelly, just don't buy it. What I tell people about chopping the cabbage for sauerkraut is that you can chop it any way you like it. Some people like to go really thin and make long strings with the cabbage. Some people like to make tiny little pieces. I wouldn't recommend using a food processor or any other kind of mechanical chopper because it kind of crushes your cabbage, and you're going to do that yourself later. I like for my sauerkraut to be in fairly large chunks, like this. Now, I mentioned earlier that this is an important part of Appalachian history, and it really is. Sometimes it gets confusing around here because the old timers will refer to things that are fermented as pickled. It's really kind of funny. You have to ask people when they talk about pickled corn, whether it's actually pickled, which means putting it in a brine with vinegar and sugar and salt and other things, or whether it's actually fermented. And you can ferment corn and other kinds of vegetables just the way we're doing this cabbage. So you can ferment all kinds of different vegetables. You can even mix things with the sauerkraut, with the cabbage here for your sauerkraut. But I thought today we'd just keep it really simple so that you'll have a good idea about how to do this with the easiest possible combination of ingredients, which are just cabbage and salt. It doesn't get much simpler than cabbage and salt. And a little bit of elbow grease. So, my friend Wanda, who taught me how to preserve and can, her name's Wanda Buddha, and she grew up in Johnson City. Actually, she grew up in Jonesboro, Tennessee, on a farm. And her mama taught her how to pickle she told me that they used to always have a root cellar full of fermented things that they'd eat with every meal. That was how they preserved their vegetables through the winter, if they didn't can them. And she said that one of her favorite things was the cabbage stalk, and that her mama would take the stalk and just put it whole right down in the brine. And Wanda said when she was a good girl, her mama would let her have a cabbage core. So, fermenting was important to Wanda's family, and it was important to a lot of other people's families because it let them have sort of a version of fresh vegetables through the winter without having to do all the work of canning. My father-in-law said that one of his favorite things was mixed pickles, and that's one of those confusing things. It was actually fermented, not pickled, and it was a mixture of green beans and corn fermented in a salt brine, and it's delicious. If you've never had it, it is really, really good. Fermented corn will make you want to smack your mama, as they say around here. It's so delicious. And Neil, my father-in-law, said that his grandmother would send his grandfather out behind the barn to get rid of all of last year's mixed pickles. And they'd be dumping out the crocks full of food. And his grandfather liked it really funky, because the longer it sits, the kind of the funkier it gets, the tangier it gets. And his grandfather would sit there and they'd be pouring out the crock, just dumping out these crocks, and his grandfather would be saying, "Oh, every year she waits till it's just right, and then she makes me get rid of it." So you only had so much room, you couldn't keep it all. One other nice thing about this is you can make your whole winter's supply of sauerkraut in one fell swoop. We're just going to do about half of this cabbage today. During my television or YouTube debut on Create a Stir, just so that you can get the idea. Now, there are a lot of good videos out there that talk about fermenting, and they show you how to do things by weight. But I learned how to do all this stuff from little old ladies, the really old-fashioned way. And they do a lot of things by feel. So I do some of it by feel, and I do some of it by just the formulas that they've told me for success. I don't cut this up tiny. I cut it up in fairly big chunks because they shrink a little bit. And if you ask me, and this may just be my own wives' tale, but they stay a little crunchier if they're just a little bit larger. So the formula that I learned for this is for every 5 pounds of cabbage, you want a scant tablespoonful of salt. If your cabbage isn't 5 pounds, that's okay. Just do a little math. And if you don't like doing math, a guesstimate will work. What you're trying to do with the salt is you're trying to create a brine that will encourage the good bacteria to grow and that will discourage the bacteria that you don't want. This is actually a very safe method if you get your brine right of preserving food. For every 5 pounds of cabbage, as I said, you need about a scant tablespoon of kosher salt. Now I use kosher salt because it keeps my sauerkraut from being cloudy. You can use sea salt. You can use pretty much any kind of salt you want. I don't recommend using Morton's table salt because there's Morton's kosher salt is great, but Morton's table salt has just, if you buy the iodized version, has just like a little bit of a bitter taste. And it will make your kraut cloudy. If you don't care, just go on with that iodized salt. But I use kosher or sea salt. So I'm trying to get about 2.5 pounds of cabbage in this container here. It's not very attractive, but I know how much it weighs. It weighs a little over an ounce, and that lets me gauge how much kraut I've got. And once I get this chopped up, I think I'm going to be close to about 2.5 pounds. and you don't have to be right on the money. My husband's very exact about these things. He has to have it right on the money, and he has to measure everything and weigh everything and do it like sort of the chemistry major way. I do it the little old lady way, like I was taught. That's my favorite way. So let me get the scale over here. Any kind of scale will do as long as it measures in ounces and you can see how much you've got. So I'm going to set this to ounces. I'm going to set this on it, and we've got 2 pounds, 9 3/4 ounces, which is just a tiny little bit over 2.5 pounds, which is what you want because you have to figure the tare weight in, the tare being the container that your cabbage is in. Now, when I teach a class, this is the part that everybody loves. This is the part where you get to go crazy pounding your kraut. So let me show you how we do this. I'm going to move the knife out of the way, and I'm going to get this bowl. And I'm going to take this cabbage, and I'm going to dump it in the bowl. And since we have 2.5 pounds, I want a scant ½ tablespoon of salt in there. Here's my handy dandy Morton's kosher salt. Here's my tablespoon. And I'm gonna I kind of guess, because I'm me. If you're nervous about that, you can measure more carefully, but this is how it works. You wanna put this in here, and then here's the fun part. You just take it and you fluff it. Now that salt is going to protect the kraut from the bad bacteria. It's going to encourage the good bacteria. And the other thing it's going to do is it's going to bring the water out of this cabbage. And if you can see under the lights here, you can already see some of the moisture glistening in that cabbage after I put the salt on it. And it just keeps pulling it out. Now, I told you, I love old recipes and old food ways, and I love old cooking implements. So this is one of my favorite things. This is a kraut mallet. It's nice and smooth on the bottom, and if you're fermenting in mason jars, you'll be interested to see that this will just fit down inside a wide mouth mason jar, so you can ferment inside a wide mouth mason jar if you like. I've got these beautiful crocks. Well, I'm going to talk about them in a minute. So you can see this water coming out of this cabbage here. We're going to help it. And this is where, if you're frustrated or you're stressed out, sauerkraut helps with that too, because you get to go, and you get to pound it and bruise it to bring the water out even more quickly. So we're going to pound this kraut. Sometimes I do this outside because it's a messy job, and because it's nice to do it outside. You don't have to sweep the floor. It's all done. So you just pound your kraut, and you want to kind of make sure that you bruise it pretty well, because that helps the salt bring the water out. You don't have to pound it till it's mushy. You just have to pound it until you can really see the water coming out of the kraut, and until it's clearly sort of bruised and a little softer than it was when you first put it in the bowl to put the salt on it. So then you just wipe your mallet off and set it aside for a minute. And then what you're going to do is fill the kraut crocks. Now these crocks, I just got these crocks a few weeks ago, and I'm so excited about them. They're made by Carrie Porcher, who's a potter in Unicoi, and I went up there to talk to him about making some handmade crocks for me, because I figured it would class up my cooking demos a little bit, my sauerkraut classes, and boy did he take it and run with it. He made me 2 shapes, and we ultimately decided that this barrel shape here is a little better, and I'll show you why. It has its own weight, this beautiful crock. It's a barrel shape, and it's got this weight that fits down inside it. And then we also have this, which I had originally asked for because I love this sort of tapered shape, this vessel, but it's not quite as good, and let me show you why. When you put your lid down or your weight down in your crock, you want as little space as possible between the sides and the material that you're fermenting. And you want about 1 inch of brine above the weight. And the reason for that is that the brine protects the kraut that you're fermenting, and you can, if it has what we call a bloom, it's actually sort of a mold, but people don't like mold, so I call it a bloom. And you're gonna get a bloom, and don't worry about it, it's fine. It's gonna look white and yeasty, and there may be a little moldy looking bit floating here and there on top. And all you do, you're gonna have the weight on there, all you do is reach in there and just pull that off the top and toss it in your compost pile. That's all you have to do. And if your brine gets too low, you're gonna add a little brine, but I'll tell you how to do that later. So anyway, Carrie made me this beautiful piece, and it works really well, but we decided that this one you can fill up farther, this barrel-shaped one. So I'm gonna take this gorgeous barrel-shaped crock here, fermentation crock. I'm gonna take the weight out for now and just set it aside, and I'm gonna take all of this kraut that I chopped, and I'm gonna pack it down in here, but I'm gonna do it little by little. So I'm gonna take a big handful of kraut, and I'm gonna put it down here in the container. And then I use my tamper, my kraut mallet for the second time, and I just pack it down in there. You don't have to pack it too tightly. You just want sort of an even layer. You wanna look down in there, make sure it's even all the way around, and then just keep adding your kraut, a couple of handfuls at a time. And tamp it down in here. We're gonna pack that down tightly, and then we just take the weight right here and we put it on top. Now let me stop for a minute and talk about why cabbage, and particularly just plain old sauerkraut, is the easiest thing to do. It really honestly makes its own brine. And within 24 hours, you're gonna take a look in here and you're gonna see that that brine comes up, and he made this about 1 inch, handy. The brine comes up to about here. If you wanna do it in a jar or you wanna do it in a more traditional crock, then there are lots of ways that you can weigh the cabbage down. One way is to take a regular Ziploc bag, and you wanna fill it with brine, not water, but brine. The reason for that is if your bag breaks, you don't want water in your kraut. That's gonna spoil the salt levels, and you might have spoilage in your kraut. So you wanna fill it with brine, and you can just take it and you can stuff it down in there on top of the kraut and use that as a weight. Another thing you can do is you can buy these wonderful glass weights. They're made by the Ball Company, the same company that makes canning jars. And they're sort of flat and they have a little ridge on the top. You can buy the weights that either go down in regular sized mason jar mouths or that go in wide mouths. And you just put that down there, like in a half-gallon wide mouth jar or even a quart wide mouth jar, and it will hold your vegetables under the brine. If I need to make some extra brine, let's say my kraut doesn't have quite enough brine above it, I want about 1 inch, 1.5 inches is even better. Then I just take a tablespoon per cup, and this is a pint jar, which is 2 cups. And I put my 2 tablespoons of water in there, 2 tablespoons of salt in there. I fill it up with water, put the lid on it, shake it to mix it up really well. And I've already got this brine made so that if I don't get 1 inch of brine over the top of my kraut in the morning, I can use this. The last thing you do before you put your kraut to bed for the first night is you put its nightcap on. I use these pieces of cheesecloth. This keeps dust and bugs and things like that out of your kraut. It makes them look very old-fashioned too, which I like. And you just put them over the jar. Now I like to put 2 layers because cheesecloth isn't that tightly woven. And then you just take a string and you tie it shut so that no little gnats or fruit flies or anything like that will get in there, because they do love fermenting things. So if you don't want fruit flies in your fermented things, and this is it. I'll turn that around so you can see my nice little bow, right? So this is done for now. And what we'll do is we'll wait, and in 24 hours, we'll come back, we'll lift this up, we'll check it out, and if there's about an inch of brine in there, then you've done your job. And what you do is wait. Now let me talk about that just a little bit. Depending on how warm it is in your house or outside or wherever it is you're fermenting, the warmth will affect your fermentation process. The warmer it is, the faster the process goes. So if it's warm in your house, this is going to be done, it could be done in 5 to 7 days. It's also going to be a little tangier. When things ferment more quickly, they get like a little more tangy. My favorite, we're coming up on it, is the fall and the winter. When the weather gets cooler, my house gets cooler, my basement gets cooler, which is where I often will ferment things. And that slows it down and you get this wonderful, mild, fermented flavor. How do you know it's done? That's the important thing, right? When can I eat it? It's done when you like it. So what you do is you untie your little string here. You reach in, and if you get that bloom, remember, don't panic. Just take your hand. It'll pretty much come together with your hand, and you can just put it in your other hand and throw it in your compost bin. But to taste it, you're just going to lift up your weight. You're going to take a little taste. Just tastes like salty cabbage right now, of course. But when it tastes good to you, that's when you want to take it out, put it in a larger jar with a lid. I use half-gallon mason jars or quart mason jars, and put it in your refrigerator. Putting it in the refrigerator slows the fermentation process down enough that it's almost imperceptible. And honest to goodness, I make a batch of kraut for my dad every year. I just took him his 2 half-gallon jars that I had fermented for him, and they last him a year because he eats just a tiny little bit of kraut every day because he thinks it keeps him healthy and he likes it. So that's it. That's it. That's all it takes to make sauerkraut. Something delicious, something historic, something good for you. And if you have questions, you can email me at katie@createappalachia.org. And remember the org because we're a nonprofit, not com. createappalachia.org. And that's KATIE @createappalachia.org. The other thing that you can do is this book. I don't get any any kickbacks for selling this, but this book is called Wild Fermentation, the Flavor, Nutrition, and Craft of Live Culture Foods. And it's by Sandor Elix Katz, K-A-T-Z. And he's sort of the fermenting guru. So if you want some quick processes for fermenting things, this is sort of his Fermenting for Dummies level book. It will tell you how to ferment all kinds of things, make yogurt, all kinds of things like that. And it's quick and easy to read. And then there's his tome, his great big book, which is more dry and goes into a lot more scientific detail, but I love it. And it was a New York Times bestseller, so somebody loved it. It's called The Art of Fermentation, and it's a James Beard award-winning book, and it's a wonderful reference if you really get into it. There are also a lot of super good YouTube videos that will help you. And I would love, if you make some kraut, I would love to hear about it. I'd love for you to email me and tell me how it went. If you have a disaster, tell me that too, and I'll try to tell you how to fix it next time. I want to give just one more shout out to Carrie Porcher, who worked on these designs. You know, one of the things we do at Create Appalachia is try to incubate artistic businesses and creative entrepreneurs. And when I went to Carrie with a crock that I thought I wanted him to copy, one that was shaped more like the dragonfly crock here, he did some research and he really got into the whole traditional fermentation process, and he designed crocks that really work well. It's Porcher pottery. It's Porche pottery. It's in Unicoi, Tennessee. You can find him on Facebook, and he makes these beautiful crocks. And if you decide that you want to ferment, not only will your food be beautiful after it's fermented, it will be beautiful while it gets there as well. So thank you, Carrie, for working with me on that. You're just one more of the creative treasures of our region, so thank you so much. Again, my name is Katie Hoffman. I'm the Executive Director at Create Appalachia, and happy fermenting!